Bonjour. Good afternoon. August Jadif Kharja. It's a genuine pleasure to join you and to participate in this two-day seminar on the Irish missionary tradition through the ages. It is, of course, audacious in the extreme to try to encapsulate the concept of Ireland's so-called spiritual empire during the late 19th and early 20th centuries in a brief presentation, such as this, and I make no claims to being comprehensive. If anything, what I hope to accomplish today is to speculate with you about the very concept of spiritual empire and how it helped to shape Irish identity in the period under review. At the same time, I want to engage with some of the important scholarship on the history of the Catholic Church, education, and empire that has been one of the areas I've studied over the course of the last several years. In my time with you, I will lay out what I think are some important markers about the imperial studies and migration and Ireland's place in these phenomena. Then I will engage the most important study at the moment about the reshaping of the global Irish world in the 19th century. That is Colin Barr's recent volume, Ireland's Empire, the Roman Catholic Church in the English-speaking world, 1829 to 1914, and what Barr calls hibernal Roman Catholicism. But I'm going to highlight two lacunae in it. Next, I will highlight briefly how probing these lacunae will enhance our understanding of Barr's global Ireland, and indeed of the ways in which missionary activity created space for the Irish to think of themselves. And what interests me most is that concept of how the Irish thought of themselves and how mission activity appealed to the Irish at home and helped to create a new identity for them in the 20th century. I realize that this is a lot of ground to cover, and I hope the question time will allow us to fill in at least some of the gaps that will inevitably be left open. So to begin, it's worth recalling that Europeans were not the only imperialists in the 19th and 20th centuries, nor were they new to empire building in the modern period, but they were particularly adept at it. Technological advances, the desire for investment opportunities, the migration of peoples, social Darwinist thinking, all of these exacerbated long-standing competition among European powers, such that between the 1870s and the 19-teens, there was a spate of new imperial acquisition. To put this into perspective, if we think just about the so-called scramble for Africa, in 1875, Europeans owned and ruled only 11% of the African continent, but by 1902, that total had reached 90%. That was an incredible increase in just a matter of a couple of decades. Investment helped to fuel this process, as did migration. Astoundingly, the population of Europe grew by some 50% between 1850 and 1900, yet that occurred while tens of millions of Europeans left the continent for the United States and elsewhere. By one estimate, between 1846 and 1932, nearly 60 million people left Europe for North and South America and points beyond. We know that the Irish were outsized contributors to this stream, and that if we think about post-famine migration in particular, they were very quick in terms of the pace for out-migration. Kevin Kenny, for example, has noted that between 1820 and 1920, some 5 million left Ireland for the United States, another 1.5 million for Britain, and another million for settler colonies throughout the British Empire, places like Australia and New Zealand and Canada. It's similarly worth recalling that competition for souls was a significant factor as Europe's population grew and moved throughout the world. Roman Catholic, Protestant, and dissenting communities remained intense rivals on the island of Ireland and potentially around the world. Thus, what Irene Whelan memorably called the Bible War of the 1820s lived in Irish folk memory well into the 20th century, particularly because of the ongoing activities of organizations like the Society for the Irish Missions to the Roman Catholics and the Society for Promoting the Education of the Native Irish through the medium of their own language. But for those who thought in terms of worldwide mission activity, competition was kept to the fore. Thus, the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, founded in Lyon in 1822, reported annual contributions of nearly 2 million francs, or 80,000 pounds, in support in 1839. But it also estimated that it would need more than 8 times that amount annually in order to counter what it referred to as, quote, the extravagant salaries allowed to the lordly missionaries of the Anglican Church in the East and West Indies, the immense sums swallowed up by Methodist proconsuls who rule it over the kings of the Southern Ocean, and the innumerable hawkers of Bibles whose prudent zeal extends no further than to introducing along the coasts of China with smuggled opium the sacred writings which they profane, unquote. In short, the outward movement of the migrant Irish coincided with an intense competition among Christian missionaries. Enter Barr. Barr's latest work provides important scaffolding for understanding the structures built to sustain the Catholic faith in this imperial world, and it augments commentary by, among others, Father Oliver Rafferty and Father Edmund Hogan. Rafferty has portrayed the growth of Catholic missionary activity within the British Empire as an entente cordiale that benefited both the British Empire and the Catholic Church. And Barr sees this as occurring by the design of Catholic leaders. The chief architect in his reading was the most important Catholic figure in 19th century Ireland, Archbishop, later Paul Cullen, whose relationships with the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, or Propaganda Fide, in Rome, put him in prime position to place family, friends, and associates into leadership positions as the Church expanded within the empire and across the United States. Told with verve, Barr's investigation is based on research in 104 archives in 12 countries on 5 continents. He seeks to understand why Catholicism has long been associated with the Irish in the English-speaking world. His answer was that it was because Irish clergy, women religious, and teaching brothers, imbued with the spirit of Cullenite, Hibernicized ultramontanism, secured control of many of the leading positions across the globe. To underline that point, let me quote Cardinal Patrick Francis Moran at the consecration of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne in 1897. Moran boasted about what he called an Anglo-Celtic empire, which had some 200 Irish bishops, 16,000 Irish priests, and 20 million practicing Catholics throughout the world. 6 diocesan seminaries and Dublin's All Hallows College provided many of the priests for these parishes. I mean, between 1840 and 1896 alone, All Hallows sent out some 1,400 priests, 42.4% of them going to the United States, 28.9% to Australia and New Zealand, and 12.5% to Britain itself. Needless to say, the bulk of these placements came as Irish migrants fanned out from the home island, and perhaps nowhere was the growth more apparent than in Moran's Australia. In 1803, according to Patrick O'Farrelly, only about 2,000 Catholics resided in Australia, but by 1900, roughly 1/4 of the 3.7 million people living in Australia were Roman Catholic, just over 900,000. The nascent Commonwealth boasted 1 cardinal archbishop, 4 archbishops, 18 other bishops, 1,114 priests, 444 religious brothers, and nearly 4,000 nuns. They and their lay allies published school books, including histories written by the Christian Brothers, as well as popular fiction and news stories that circulated throughout the wide world of Catholic networks, building what Benedict Anderson might have referred to as a Catholic imagined community. Now, Barr is, by his own admission, short on references to religious orders, even in the settler colonies, thus underselling the role played by religious orders in building up these new metropolitan areas. Let me offer one brief example whose greater attention I think is richly deserved here, that being the Irish Society of Jesus. In 1865, as immigration led to the creation of 3 new dioceses in Australia and to the establishment of Dunedin as a separate see in New Zealand, the Irish province of the Society of Jesus established its Australian mission at Melbourne after propaganda and the Jesuit Father General acceded to a request from Archbishop James Alypius Gould. Bishop of Melbourne since 1848, Gould was cognizant of the need for secondary education for his burgeoning flock, and he turned to the Jesuits for aid. But correspondence from the superiors of the mission from the 1860s through the 1880s to the provincial back in Ireland reflect their many hopes, frustrations, trials, and ultimately successes. They performed parish work in Melbourne, taught in Victoria and South Australia, and over time they established a presence in New South Wales as well. They also led retreats for clergy and acted as consultors for bishops and archbishops throughout Australia, Tasmania, and New Zealand. In retrospect, their most obvious legacies were the management of numerous secondary day schools, including St. Patrick's College for the Melbourne Diocese, and the foundation of two outstanding boarding schools, St. Ignatius College Riverview, overlooking Sydney Harbour, and pictured here, and St. Xavier's College, Kew, in Melbourne, as well as Newman College at the University of Melbourne. But these successes were far from assured in the early years of the mission, when they encountered standoffishness from the secular clergy, a lack of money and men from the Home Office, if you will, in Dublin, and competition from other orders, especially the French Society of Mary, the Marists, who had charge of the church's mission to Oceania and whose schools rivaled those that the Jesuits built. I would point out, though, that within only 40 years of setting up their mission, roughly 1/3 of the Irish Jesuit province, 109 men, were actually stationed on the mission in Australia. So it was an incredibly powerful and growing entity, both within the Irish province and in Australia itself. Now, primary mission work is something that Barr also ignored. What we've been talking about here in the case of the Jesuits would be seen in Hogan's terms as secondary mission work, that is, a mission to those who were already baptized in the faith. Primary mission work, on the other hand, would be to those who were not yet baptized in the faith. And this received a great fillip across Ireland, particularly as French missionary orders established schools on the island of Ireland. Along with the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, the Holy Ghost Fathers, the Sisters of Our Lady of the Apostles, and others, the Society of Missions to Africa, or Society of African Missions, if you will, was part of this wider effort. And that's going to be the primary focus of the rest of my talk here this afternoon. Unlike the Holy Ghost Fathers, who arrived in 1859 and who set up educational institutions while keeping their missionary activity in the background, the SMA Superior General, Father Augustine Plunk, made clear at the Society's launch in 1877 that it expected its Irish recruits to take direction from their French leadership. The early days of the SMA in County Cork were lackluster. What transformed the situation was the arrival of a new superior for the Irish mission in 1883, Father Joseph Zimmermann, a Swiss member of the SMA, who recognized that attention to local concerns mattered. This was, after all, the era of the Hiberno-Roman Church that Colin Barr spoke of. Zimmermann cultivated a close relationship with Bishop William Delaney's successor, Bishop Thomas O'Callaghan, and eventually gained other important ecclesiastical allies, particularly Cardinal Michael Logue, Archbishop John Healy of Tuam, and Bishop Robert Brown of Cloyne. He also developed the idea that the SMA in Ireland should become more of an Irish missionary operation, a project that he outlined to members of the Irish hierarchy who later championed his cause in Rome. Whereas Plunk had looked askance at Irish members of the Society, Zimmermann advocated for his students even after they had left for France. And he worked steadily alongside Irish colleagues, including most especially Father John Barrett, a native of Westport, who had joined the SMA in 1877. Although Barrett was passed over as a possible leader for the apostolic school that was established at Wilton outside Cork, Barrett traveled widely to recruit students for the school and to raise burses for it. A burse was roughly £500, which would be used to cover a student's yearly fees. Finally, while Zimmermann continued his predecessor's practice of placing advertisements in the press and the Irish Catholic Directory, soliciting both donations and recruiting students, he answered any donor letter with a sincere thank you. Now, this may sound like a simple practice that any well-bred fundraiser would perform, but one of Zimmerman's detailed and personalized missives had an effect that even he could not have anticipated. This came toward the end of the 1890s, when a retired lieutenant colonel of the Connaught Rangers, Llewellyn Blake, sent a small donation in answer to an advertisement that appeared in the Irish Catholic newspaper. It was actually one of several donations that this childless widower sent to various missionary schools and orders at about the same time. Zimmerman's reply, detailing his hope to create a genuine Irish overseas missionary enterprise, clearly piqued Blake's interest. Between 1900 and 1906, Blake donated a full 40 burses, roughly 20,000 pounds, to the school at Wilton. Subsequently, he donated property in counties Mayo and Galway to the SMA, at which the society established 2 more schools. Ultimately, Blake provided that 8/15 of his estate, approximately 60,000 more pounds, would support these schools. To manage these gifts, Zimmerman set up trusts, with Archbishop Healy and Bishop O'Callaghan serving as trustees. These were not the only gifts coming to the SMA at the turn of the 20th century, but they were far and away the most significant because they ensured that students could attend the school, and indeed that they made the Irish branch of the SMA self-sustaining, which led Zimmerman to approach officials in Rome about granting the Irish branch the status fully of a province, a move that Planck's successor, Monsignor Pellet, resisted. But in 1911, propaganda granted this status. At a cost, however, Pellet demanded that Zimmerman be removed as head of the province. So this raises the question, what types of messages did Zimmerman and his fellow SMA priests spread throughout Ireland, and who were the students who benefited from Blake's largesse? To answer these questions, I've been looking at materials published by the SMA and developing a social profile of those who joined the society. Let me begin with a brief look at messaging. An exemplary piece was the short book authored by Zimmerman in 1906, Missionary Experience on the West Coast of Africa. This 82-page work bears the hallmarks of newspaper accounts such as those that the Holy Ghost Fathers shared weekly in the Irish Catholic and of revival meetings, both Catholic and Protestant. These hallmarks included direct address to the readers. Thus, the opening 4 paragraphs spoke to various audiences. You who are young, youth, or maiden, beaming with life and enthusiasm for a field worthy of your noble ambition. You who are advanced in age, broken in health and strength. This little tale will encourage you to cast the net once more, and it will point out the right spot where to catch a rich draught and retrieve lost labor and pain. You who are rich, learn from these lines where to store up your treasures. Beautiful stuff. They included anthropological accounts of the Negro, the generic, the Negro, that reeked of social Darwinist racialism. For instance, one cringeworthy passage about arriving in Lagos began, "A newcomer from Europe is at first at a loss, thinking he will never be able to distinguish one from the other. All appear of the same black color." Indigenous peoples are described as generally polytheistic and potentially a danger to visitors after dark. Warfare, the book said, remained a source of income and labor, as captured prisoners might be sold or subjected to what were called the most excruciating pains, including burial up to one's neck. And here we see a missionary encountering one of these poor souls buried up to his neck. But there was also the call to action aimed squarely at the Irish as part of a worldwide enterprise. Why should not this heroic apostolate find young Irish subjects to carry on the evangelization of an outcast race? I shall return to this point in a minute. Who joined the society? I've compared data contained in the chronological register of members of the SMA's Irish province with the 1901 and 1911 manuscript census returns, and with an internal biographical dictionary of members to create a social profile of approximately 250 of those whose dates of birth occurred prior to the 1st of January 1911. Now that cutoff date I chose because it restricts my view to students who would have attended St. Joseph's Wilton or one of the other schools prior to partition and the creation of the Irish Free State. In other words, pre-independence students of the SMA. Of this cohort, the vast majority of them, 157 or 62.3%, were born after 1890. It was these boys who would have benefited from the largesse of Blake and others, while those born as early as the 1840s included young adults or even middle-aged adults who joined the SMA at or around the time of its establishment in Ireland. Father Barrett, whom I mentioned earlier, would be a case in point. He was born in 1844 and moved to Lyon to join the society and study theology and philosophy at the age of 33. These students came from nearly every county in Ireland. The register includes diocese of origin for each member and birthplace for the vast majority of members, 224 of them to be precise. Of these, 64.3% came from the ecclesiastical provinces of Cashel or Tuam. Not a surprising result, given the connection between Bishop O'Callaghan, Bishop Brown, and Archbishop Healy to Zimmerman and the Society. Blake's properties in counties Galway and Mayo undoubtedly brought the Tuam connection to the fore. Noteworthy on the map here of dioceses from across Ireland, however, is the heavy concentration of members coming from counties Mayo and Cork, and particularly from the Archdiocese of Tuam and the Diocese of Cork and Ross. You'll see there 35 and 34 recruits respectively. Also note the concentrations in the Diocese of Athenry and Clonfert, perhaps again because of the proximity to Tuam and to the Blake connection, as well as to a cluster of Munster dioceses in Limerick, Kerry, and Cloyne. Two further clusters, though, have caught my eye. One is the Dublin and Kildare-Leland cluster, which makes up almost 72% of the entire membership hailing from the Dublin Episcopal Province, and that heavy concentration up in the northeast of members coming from the Diocese of Down and Connor, more than 39% of those coming from the Armagh Province, just from that one diocese alone. Part of the explanation, I think, for the high concentration is likely to be the ties between specific bishops and archbishops and the potential recruits, as I said a moment ago. But another factor, pardon me, probably has to do with family or parish connections. Perhaps the largest such concentration began with Patrick or Patsy McCarthy of Achadown Parish in Skibbereen, who was born in 1897 and entered the Sacred Heart College at Balnafad, the first of Blake's properties to be converted into a school in 1912. Patsy came from a family and a parish rich in connections to the society. His younger brother Florence, four of his male cousins all joined the SMA, while another cousin, Mairead Hickey, joined the OLA, which not only sent nuns into the mission field, they also staffed many of the ancillary offices at Wilton, essentially taking care of the students and priests at St. Joseph's College there. Another parishioner from Achadown, Florence O'Driscoll, also joined the SMA. So you've got a real cluster of family and local people who all joined. Another issue made plain in comparing the register to the census is the social backgrounds of the SMA members was significantly different from their more elite Jesuit contemporaries, or even the average priest of 19th century Ireland. O'Shea and others have demonstrated that between 2/3 and 3/4 of priests in the late 19th century came from strong farming backgrounds, but the SMA was considerably more diverse than this. Now, I have been able to trace roughly 82 members of the cohort that I've been looking at through the census to gain a sense of their parental occupations. And in comparison to the 1901 and 1911 censuses, as well as comparisons to their obituaries in the SMA's archives. and their membership seems considerably more diverse. To be sure, while, as I said before, 2/3 to 3/4 of Irish priests came from strong tenant farming backgrounds, in the SMA sample, it was a smaller percentage, though a significant plurality. 41.5% came from farmers' families. Uh, Intriguingly, the fathers of two SMA members demonstrated the generational dynamic of the strong farming class in the successive 1901 and 1911 censuses. John Patrick Murphy's father, also John, described himself as a farmer's son in 1901, but as a farmer in 1911, suggesting that he had inherited his father's farm. While Philip McMahon's father, John, described himself as a father's son-in-law in 1901, suggesting that he married into a farm rather than inheriting it directly from his father. Another cohort to be considered, perhaps, would be the town-based cousins of the strong farmers. We see that 3 of the recruits were the sons of shopkeepers, another the son of a coal merchant and insurance agent, and 3 were the sons of builders, one of whom described themselves as a building contractor. 2 were actually the sons of RIC constables, one of an RIC sergeant and another of a police pensioner. 2 were the children of military officers, one a naval officer and the other from the Army. But we must also recognize that something on the order of 40% of those students came from relatively poor, working class, indeed urban backgrounds. These included the sons of a fisherman and a farmer's hand, of a railway coachman and a bootmaker, a hackle maker and a pork ranger, a warehouse man and a dock laborer, as well as a spindle setter and a stone cutter, and 2 were brewery laborers. Most intriguingly, 14 had mothers with declared occupations as well. Only 1 listed herself as a farmer's wife, and 1 listed herself as a shopkeeper. 6 of these were housekeepers. 2 were dressmakers. Another listing herself as a seamstress, and 1 called herself a farm servant, while still another merely a servant. A final mother listed herself as a factory smoother. Specifically notable, the mothers listed as servant and seamstress were in families where no father was listed at all. In other words, they seemed to be single working mothers. Many of these working class households were in those urban areas, Dublin and down in Connor area around Belfast and their environs. What all of this points to is the importance of the bursaries. These young men needed financial aid to attend the Apostolic College. Generally, the impression in 19th century Ireland was that foreign mission priests were less prestigious positions than were parish priests at home, or indeed missions into the settler colonies. But what it also underlines to me, and I think this is the most important point, is that messages about exotic locales and civilizing mission filtered throughout Irish society. It was not just limited to the upper middle classes and the strong farming classes. These messages spread down into the working classes and indeed the rural poor. As I've suggested elsewhere, empire and imperial enterprises enabled Irish men and women of different communities and different Christian denominations to project onto themselves various ideological stances. Almost like Harry Potter's mirror of Erised, they could allow one to view themselves as however they desired. Thus, mission work provided members of the disestablished Church of Ireland to claim a link to an ancient patrician tradition, providing them with a special role in the Anglican Communion at the turn of the 20th century. While concerns over the brute force of the Mahdi army and the supposed barbarism of the Boxers in China could be contrasted by home rulers with the rational approach to governance that they advocated in order to answer Tory taunts that the Irish were no better than the Hottentots. In the case outlined here today, what is striking is the way that even though the Irish SMA priests were deployed in the British Empire and supported by that empire in the Entente Cordiale of Oliver Rafferty's take, their work was not seen as of that empire. To be sure, the estate that provided the support necessary to keep them afloat had its basis in the British Empire. Blake was, after all, a retired military officer and landlord. His diversified portfolio included investments in Irish railways, stocks in the Hudson's Bay Company and the Republic of the Honduras, shares in a gold loan made to the Chinese government, as well as Government of New Zealand consolidated stock and inscribed stock in the Government of South Australia and the Dominion of Canada. It's hard to get a wider imperial portfolio than Blake had. Publicly, however, the rhetoric employed, both to recruit members up and down the social scale and to justify the mission to potential donors, placed the Irish in the mainstream of European and late 19th century Catholic thought, complete with their overtones of social Darwinism and civilizing mission. To expand, the SMA had to cease being a French body, and it grew when Zimmerman consciously invoked it as an Irish enterprise within the confines of Barr's Greater Ireland. But he never did stop using that European intellectual context. Invoking the work of the SMA, and indeed of other missionary bodies, he asked, is not this outburst of apostolic spirit and the feeling and sympathy of all Europe in favor of desolate Africa the finger of God, showing that Africa's hour of salvation has finally struck? And that hour would be told by Irish men and Irish women who were coming to see themselves playing a role distinctly important as Irish, uniquely their own. A role reinforced in mission magazines and popular literature, shilling donation campaigns, and bazaars in the years before Irish independence and carried forward for decades after independence. Understanding that emergent sensibility as European and independently Irish was a 20th century phenomenon for the people of the island of Ireland, but its expression in the missions, which appealed to Catholics in Ireland up and down the social scale, was deeply rooted in the 19th, as I hope I've shown here today. Thank you very much.